May 8th, 1945. Kempton Park Racecourse, Surrey, England. The dawn came gray and cold over the improvised prison compound where the grandstands once held cheering crowds. Now they held silence. 317 German women sat in the converted stables and betting halls, their bodies rigid, their eyes fixed on nothing. Outside, British guards paced in the mist, their boots scuffing against gravel still stained with pre-war celebration. The war in Europe had ended precisely 14 hours earlier. Church bells had rung across London through the night. Crowds had danced in Piccadilly. But here, in this hastily erected cage of chain link and concertina wire, no one celebrated. The women waited. They had been waiting since their capture 3 weeks prior near Bremen, waiting through the chaos of surrender, waiting through the truck convoys that brought them across a shattered continent, waiting for what they believed was inevitable. They were Wehrmachtshelferinnen, Women's Auxiliary Corps, and a smaller number were Blitzmädel, the Lightning Girls, who had served in roles the Reich never officially acknowledged, but every soldier understood. They had typed reports and bandaged wounds and operated switchboards, and, yes, some had provided what the German military euphemistically termed frontline morale services. Now they were prisoners, and prisoners of war who were women had learned across 5,000 years of human conflict to expect one particular fate. They braced for rape. They braced for public humiliation. They braced for their bodies to become the final battlefield where victorious men inscribed their triumph. Every woman in that compound had heard the stories filtering back from the Eastern Front, what Soviet soldiers did in East Prussia, the screams that echoed through Königsberg, the bodies found in Nemmersdorf. They had heard whispers of what French resistance fighters did to collaborationist women, heads shaved and stripped naked, paraded through jeering crowds. They knew what conquest looked like when the veneer of civilization burned away. The British soldiers outside their barracks were men whose cities had been bombed by the Luftwaffe, men whose brothers and fathers had died in North Africa and Normandy fighting the Wehrmacht these women had served, men who had been told for 6 years that Germans were the enemy. The women waited for those men to collect their due. The door to Barrack C opened at 0600 hours. A British sergeant entered, middle-aged, mustached, carrying a clipboard. The women flinched. Some pressed themselves against the far wall. Others simply closed their eyes. The sergeant looked at them with the weary expression of a man who had seen too much of war to find any glory in this moment. He cleared his throat. "Right then," he said, in accented but clear German. "Breakfast is at 0630 in the main hall. You'll form 2 lines. You'll receive porridge, bread, and tea. After breakfast, you'll be assigned to barracks duties, cleaning, laundry, meal preparation. Those with nursing or medical training report to Corporal Williams. Those with secretarial skills report to Lieutenant Henderson. We need to process your paperwork. You are prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention. You will be treated as such. Any questions?" The silence that followed was not relief. It was confusion. It was cognitive dissonance so profound that several women would later report feeling physically ill. This was not the script. This was not how conquering armies behaved. This was not what they had been prepared for, warned about, braced against. A young woman near the front, Greta Hoffmann, age 22, formerly a telephone operator with the 6th Army, raised her hand tentatively. We will not be—" She could not finish the sentence. The sergeant looked at her with something between pity and irritation. "You will not be mistreated," he said firmly. "You will follow camp rules. You will work your assigned duties. You will be repatriated to Germany when arrangements are made. That is all." He turned and left. The door closed. 317 women stared at each other in the dim light of the converted stable, trying to comprehend what had just not happened. Comprehend what had just not happened. To understand the shock these women experienced requires understanding what they expected and why they expected it. The treatment of female prisoners of war existed in a legal and moral gray zone that every army preferred not to examine too closely. The 1929 Geneva Convention technically protected all prisoners of war regardless of sex, but it was written by men who imagined war as a masculine affair, a contest between uniformed soldiers on defined battlefields. The reality of total war had shattered that gentleman's fiction. By 1945, women served in military roles across every combatant nation, as nurses, as radio operators, as anti-aircraft gunners, as pilots, as resistance fighters. The Soviet Union alone had mobilized over 800,000 women into direct combat roles. Nazi Germany, despite its official ideology of Kinder, Küche, Kirche, children, kitchen, church, had been forced by manpower shortages to deploy 500,000 women in the Wehrmachtshelferinnen and Blitzmädel by 1944. These women wore uniforms. They lived on military bases. They served under military discipline. But when they became prisoners, the legal frameworks and moral codes that theoretically protected male POWs dissolved into ambiguity. The historical record is brutal in its clarity. When Soviet forces overran German positions in East Prussia in early 1945, they treated female auxiliaries as they treated female civilians, as objects of sexual violence on a scale that remains difficult to comprehend. Contemporary estimates suggest that at least 100,000 German women were raped by Red Army soldiers in the first months of occupation, and female prisoners of war were particular targets because they could be isolated from civilian populations and kept in military custody where no witnesses would document what happened. The NKVD's own internal reports, declassified in the 1990s, reference disciplinary problems with female prisoners and excesses requiring correction, bureaucratic euphemisms for organized sexual assault. German women serving near the Eastern Front knew this. They had seen refugees streaming westward with the stories. They had orders to save the last bullet for themselves. But the British Army in May 1945 was not the Red Army. It was an institution built on different foundations, shaped by different cultural codes, and, perhaps most importantly, exhausted by 6 years of war in ways that made vengeance feel like work rather than relief. The British soldier who liberated Belsen and saw the corpses stacked like cordwood certainly felt rage. But he also felt the bone-deep weariness of a man who wanted nothing more than to go home, to never see another corpse, to never fire another shot, to return to a world where the most important decision was whether to have tea or coffee. The systematic sexual abuse of female prisoners would have required energy, organization, and a collective suspension of the very moral codes that soldiers told themselves they had been fighting to defend. It would have required men to become what they had spent 6 years calling the enemy. The women at Kempton Park did not understand this yet. On that first morning, they shuffled to breakfast in silence, keeping their eyes down, moving in tight, defensive clusters. The dining hall had been the racecourse's betting lounge. High ceilings, tall windows, now furnished with long wooden tables and benches. British soldiers served the food from behind a counter. Porridge in metal bowls, thick slices of brown bread, tea in chipped ceramic cups. The portions were not generous, but they were adequate. The porridge was hot. The bread was fresh. The tea was sweet. Greta Hoffmann, sitting at a table near the back, stared at her bowl as if it might contain poison. Around her, other women did the same. They had been fed worse during the chaotic final weeks of the Reich's collapse. Watery soup, stale bread, sometimes nothing. But this was different. This was the enemy feeding them. This was the enemy providing them with metal spoons instead of making them eat with their hands. This was the enemy treating them as if they were human. A British private walked between the tables, refilling teacups from a large kettle. He was young, barely old enough to shave, with red hair and a northern accent. He stopped at Greta's table. "More tea, miss?" he asked. Greta flinched. The other women at her table went rigid. The private looked confused. "It's just tea," he said, almost apologetically. "We've got plenty." He filled their cups without waiting for an answer and moved on. After he left, one of the women, Annalisa Kruger, a former nurse, began to cry silently. Not from fear, from the disorientation of kindness appearing where cruelty should have been, disorientation of kindness appearing where cruelty should have been. The symbolism of that tea kettle would recur throughout their captivity. Tea, the quintessential British ritual, the beverage that accompanied every crisis and celebration, the drink that Churchill claimed was more important to morale than ammunition. The British served it to their own troops in the trenches of the Somme. They served it during the Blitz as bombs fell on London. And now they served it to German prisoners because that was what you did. You boiled water, you added tea leaves, you poured it into cups, you maintained civilization through ritual even when civilization had nearly destroyed itself. To the German women, that tea represented something their ideology had never prepared them for. The idea that their captors might see them as human beings worthy of basic dignities rather than as symbols to be dominated or destroyed. The days that followed established a rhythm. Morning roll call at 0600, breakfast at 0630, work assignments from 0800 to 1200, lunch, more work from 1300 to 1700, dinner, evening roll call at 1900, lights out at 2200. The work was mundane, cleaning barracks, washing dishes, sorting laundry, helping in the camp infirmary. The guards were professional. They did not touch the women unnecessarily. They did not leer or make crude remarks. They enforced the rules with the same tired efficiency they applied to everything else. When a guard needed to enter a women's barracks, he knocked first. When female prisoners needed to wash or change clothes, the guards positioned themselves facing away from the facilities. Privacy, that small, revolutionary concept, was maintained with bureaucratic consistency. This behavior was not accidental, it was policy. British military regulations regarding female prisoners of war had been updated in 1943, partly in response to reports about Soviet treatment of German women, and partly because British forces were capturing increasing numbers of female auxiliaries in North Africa and Italy. The regulations were explicit. Female POWs were to be guarded exclusively by female personnel when possible, but when male guards were necessary, they were forbidden from entering private areas without female supervision, forbidden from conducting searches of female prisoners, and subject to court-martial for any sexual contact regardless of whether the prisoner claimed consent. These rules reflected both practical concerns about military discipline and deeper cultural attitudes. The British public had been outraged by reports of Nazi treatment of female resistance fighters. The propaganda value of demonstrating moral superiority was significant. But beyond strategy, there was a genuine revulsion among many British officers at the idea of adding sexual violence to the already overwhelming catalog of war's horrors. Greta Hoffmann began working in the camp administrative office 2 weeks after arrival. She had been a skilled typist in civilian life, and the British needed help processing the paperwork for thousands of POWs. She sat at a desk in a converted office, typing reports about troop movements and supply requisitions, surrounded by British clerks who treated her with polite indifference. During tea breaks, always tea breaks, a British secretary named Margaret sometimes sat beside her. Margaret was 40-something, gray-haired, with the no-nonsense manner of a woman who had kept offices running while men went off to die. She never asked Greta about the war. She never asked about ideology. She asked about typing speed and filing systems. One afternoon, while they sorted through a particularly tedious stack of requisition forms, Margaret mentioned almost casually that her husband had been killed at Dunkirk. Greta's hands froze over the typewriter keys. She waited for accusation, for anger, for the human reaction that should follow such a statement. Margaret just kept filing. "War's a terrible thing," she said quietly. "Turns the whole world into widows and orphans." She handed Greta another form. "This one needs 3 copies." The transformation was not instantaneous. It was gradual, accumulating in small moments that contradicted everything these women had been taught. They had been raised in a Reich that told them the world was divided into masters and inferiors, victors and vanquished, those who dominated and those who submitted. They had served a military machine that treated human beings as resources to be expended. They had expected their captors to operate by the same logic, that defeat meant degradation, that powerlessness meant violation. Instead, they found themselves in a world where guards complained about bureaucracy, where meals arrived on schedule, where privacy was maintained not out of kindness, but out of procedure. The British were not gentle. They were not warm, but they were consistent. They applied rules. They maintained routine. They treated their prisoners as problems to be managed rather than as enemies to be destroyed. Anneliese Kruger, the former nurse, found herself working in the camp infirmary under the supervision of a British medical officer named Captain Morrison. Morrison was 50, balding, with the perpetually exhausted look of a doctor who had spent too many years treating wounds that should never have existed. He was short-tempered about sloppy bandaging and indifferent to national origin. When Anneliese made a mistake sterilizing instruments, he corrected her with the same irritation he showed British orderlies. When she diagnosed a respiratory infection correctly, he nodded approval without commentary. One evening, after a long shift treating prisoners with dysentery, Morrison sat down heavily in his office and lit a cigarette. Anneliese was cleaning instruments in the adjacent room. "You're competent," Morrison said without looking at her. "You actually know what you're doing. Were you hospital trained?" Anneliese nodded. "Charité in Berlin, 3 years before the war." Morrison grunted. "Good hospital. My colleague presented a paper there in '37 about arterial surgery." He stubbed out his cigarette. This war was a waste of good doctors. It was not forgiveness. It was not reconciliation. It was simply the recognition that professional competence existed independent of national flags. The letters began arriving in July 1945. The British Postal Service, with characteristic efficiency, had established mail delivery to POW camps. The women could write letters home, censored, of course, checked for military intelligence, but delivered. They could receive letters from family members who had survived. Greta wrote to her mother in Hamburg, not knowing if the address still existed, not knowing if her mother was alive. She wrote carefully, saying nothing about the camp conditions because she assumed the censors would remove anything that contradicted propaganda about British cruelty. She simply said she was alive and unharmed. 3 weeks later, a reply arrived. Her mother had survived the bombing. Their apartment was gone, but she was staying with relatives in the countryside. She asked if Greta was being treated well. She asked if there was anything she needed. She asked when she would come home. Greta stared at that letter for an hour, trying to formulate a response. How could she explain that the enemy treated her better than the Reich had in its final collapsing months. How could she describe the cognitive dissonance of being guarded by men who knocked before entering, who served tea, who enforced regulations instead of whims? How could she admit that she felt safer in this British prison camp than she had felt in the last year serving the Wehrmacht? She could not. The words existed in no language she knew. So she wrote back, "I am treated according to the rules. I have work. I have food. I have shelter. I am waiting to come home." Between those simple sentences lay a revolution in understanding that she had no vocabulary to express. By autumn 1945, the camp had developed its own strange normalcy. The British organized educational classes, English language instruction, typing courses, basic nursing skills. They allowed the women to form a choir that practiced twice weekly. They celebrated the women's birthdays with small acknowledgments, an extra ration of sugar, a day off from work duty. These were not acts of generosity. They were acts of institutional inertia. The British military had systems for managing prisoners, and those systems continued operating because systems are what institutions do. But to women who had lived through the ideological extremism of the Third Reich, this mundane bureaucracy was a revelation. They had been taught that power meant domination, that victory meant humiliation, that international relations were a Darwinian struggle where the weak were crushed. Instead, they discovered that power could mean paperwork, that victory could mean boredom, that the British could defeat Germany and then express that triumph through properly filed reports and regularly scheduled tea breaks. The winter of 1945 was hard. Food shortages affected all of Britain, and POW rations were reduced. The women were hungry again, though never starving. The barracks were cold. Morale declined. Some women became depressed, staring at walls, refusing to eat. The British medical staff treated these cases as they treated physical illness, clinically without judgment. Captain Morrison prescribed rest and better nutrition for severe cases. He requisitioned vitamin supplements from military medical supplies. He was not compassionate. He was thorough. He treated despair as a medical condition to be managed. When a young woman named Helga attempted suicide by hoarding pills, Morrison had her placed under observation, but did not punish her. He simply increased monitoring and prescribed counseling sessions with a British chaplain who spoke German. The chaplain asked her about her life before the war, about her family, about what she hoped to do when she returned home. He did not ask her to renounce her past. He did not demand ideological conversion. He simply talked to her as if her life mattered enough to preserve. The tea kettle appeared again during that difficult winter. On Christmas Eve 1945, the British Guards organized a small celebration. They decorated the mess hall with paper chains made by the prisoners. They served a marginally better meal: canned meat, potatoes, gravy, and pudding made from powdered eggs and limited sugar. After dinner, they served tea. Not the usual efficient serving, but a formal tea service with tablecloths and the best cups the camp could requisition. A British sergeant stood and made a brief speech in halting German. "The war is over," he said. "You are prisoners, but you are human beings. Tomorrow, you will still be prisoners. Tonight we remember that all of us want to go home." He raised his teacup. "To peace." The women did not cheer. Many cried. But they raised their cups. Greta would remember that Christmas for the rest of her life. Not because of the meal or the decorations, but because of what it represented. The British had won. They had every reason to hate. They had lost hundreds of thousands of soldiers defeating the Wehrmacht. Their cities had been bombed. Their empire was bankrupted. And yet, on Christmas Eve, they served tea to their enemies with tablecloths. It was not mercy. It was not forgiveness. It was something she had no category for in her National Socialist education. It was the stubborn maintenance of civilized norms, even when civilization had nearly failed. It was the radical idea that human dignity was not something awarded to the victorious, but something inherent that even war could not completely destroy. Repatriation began in early 1946. The women were transported back to Germany in organized groups, processed through demobilization centers, and released to find their way home to a country that no longer existed as they had known it. Greta returned to Hamburg in March 1946. The city was rubble. Her mother's relative's house in the countryside was overcrowded with refugees. Food was scarce. The occupation authorities were overwhelmed. Everything was chaos. But Greta had learned something in that British camp that would shape the rest of her life. She had learned that systems could be fair, that rules could be applied without cruelty. That power did not automatically equal domination. She had learned these lessons not from speeches or propaganda, but from the mundane repetition of daily routines maintained by exhausted British soldiers who just wanted to go home. In the decades that followed, as Germany rebuilt and confronted its past, Greta rarely spoke about her time as a prisoner of war. When she did, usually late in life to grandchildren who could not imagine the world she had lived through, she focused on that tea kettle. The way it appeared every morning, the way the British served it without ceremony or comment, the way it represented a worldview fundamentally different from the one she had been taught. "They could have done anything to us," she told an interviewer in 1989, shortly before the Berlin Wall fell. "We were powerless. We expected the worst, and instead they served us tea." It sounds absurd, but that was more revolutionary than any political speech. That was when I understood that the ideology I had served was based on a lie. Power does not have to be cruel. Strength does not require domination. The British proved that every single day, not through kindness, but through simple, bureaucratic decency. The historical significance of the British treatment of female German POWs extends beyond individual stories. It represented a contested but genuine attempt to apply civilized norms to circumstances that tested those norms to their breaking point. The British military was not perfect. There were incidents of misconduct, guards who violated regulations, officers who looked the other way, moments when the system failed. Military courts-martial records from 1945 to 1946 document several dozen cases of British personnel being prosecuted for crimes against prisoners, including sexual assault. But these cases were prosecuted. Men were convicted and imprisoned for violating the rules. The system was not comprehensive in its protection, but it was consistent enough to be meaningful. That distinction matters. The comparison to other Allied powers is instructive. American forces generally followed similar policies regarding female POWs, though American camps held far fewer German women. Soviet forces, as documented extensively, operated under entirely different assumptions about the treatment of enemy populations. The sexual violence inflicted by Red Army soldiers on German women, both civilian and military, was systematic, widespread, and officially tolerated despite occasional efforts at discipline. French forces in Germany, particularly colonial units, also committed large-scale sexual violence against German women in the immediate post-war period. The British record, while imperfect, stood apart. This was not because British soldiers were inherently more moral, but because British military institutions maintained discipline even when it would have been easier to let it collapse. The symbolic power of that tea kettle, that recurring image of basic civility maintained through institutional routine, resonates beyond the specific historical moment. It represents the choice that societies make when they hold power over the powerless. They can choose domination, or they can choose dignity. They can choose vengeance, or they can choose regulation. They can choose to become what they fought against, or they can choose to maintain the values they claim to defend. The British choice in 1945 was not motivated primarily by moral superiority. It was motivated by exhaustion, by institutional inertia, by cultural norms about proper behavior, and by a pragmatic recognition that disciplined armies function better than chaotic ones. But the result was the same. 317 women braced for humiliation and received instead boredom, bureaucracy, and tea served on schedule. The epilogue to this story is written in the slow reconciliation between former enemies. Greta Hoffmann lived until 2003. She married, had children, worked as a secretary for the West German government, and eventually retired to a small apartment in Hamburg. She never returned to Britain. She never contacted any of her former captors, but she kept a small item on her kitchen shelf until the day she died. A chipped ceramic teacup she had somehow managed to take with her when she was repatriated. It was British military issue, marked with the broad arrow that designated government property. It was theft, technically, but it was also a memorial. Every morning for nearly 60 years, she drank her coffee from that cup. She never developed a taste for tea and remembered the lesson it represented. The lesson was this: civilization is not a destination, but a practice. It is not achieved through grand gestures, but through the accumulation of small decisions repeated until they become routine. It is not guaranteed by ideology, but maintained by individuals who choose day after day to apply rules fairly even when no one is watching, to serve tea even to enemies, to knock before entering, to treat the powerless as if they possess dignity whether they have earned it or not. The British soldiers who guarded those women in 1945 did not see themselves as philosophers or moral exemplars. They saw themselves as tired men doing a job they wanted to finish so they could go home. But in doing that job according to the rules, in maintaining the boring bureaucracy of civilized treatment, they taught their enemies a lesson more powerful than any military defeat: that a society's true character is revealed not in how it treats the powerful, but in how it treats those who have no power at all. The women who braced for humiliation and received respect instead carried that lesson back to Germany. They carried it through the occupation, through the division, through the long process of reconstruction and confronting the Reich's crimes. They carried it as they raised children in a new Germany that had to learn different values. They carried it as a small, stubborn fact that contradicted the worldview of domination they had been taught. Power had shown them mercy, not from weakness, but from strength confident enough to maintain its principles. And in that small, bureaucratic mercy, in that morning tea served on schedule, in that knocked-on door before entering, lay a truth about human dignity that survived the war that tried to destroy it. The tea kettle still boils. The lesson still holds. The choice still remains. In every moment, when power confronts powerlessness, when victor faces vanquished, when the strong hold the weak in their hands, that choice recurs: domination or dignity. The British Guards at Kempton Park Racecourse in May 1945 made their choice. 317 women learned from that choice. And somewhere, in a small apartment in Hamburg, a chipped ceramic teacup sat on a shelf, holding the memory of a moment when civilization chose, barely and imperfectly, to survive.